Greetings all. Welcome if you're new, welcome back if you're not. Today we're going to take a look at setting up Scalar inside of Studio One, both just using the Scalar instruments as well as using Scalar to drive external instruments. So this is geared primarily for beginners, but there may be a few tips and tricks in here for seasoned veterans. And let's go ahead and bring Studio One up, and that should be okay. And I'm going to check, just make sure that my scalar is popping up for you as well. There we go, and we should be in good shape. So we're just running, I think we're at Scalar 2.4. We can look at that by just clicking on the icon there. Actually 2.5 it looks like. Yeah, 2.5. And Studio One 5.5, it's March of 2022. So we're going to run our regular just clear state in Scalar. It's pretty much a default Scalar instance, other than I have changed the default instrument to substantial. I've basically just drug a Scalar instance to get it into my Studio One. Just drag this straight in, and that's where we are. So here's the scenario. We drag it in, just starting to play with it, start tapping along. We can hear instruments, things sound good. And we say, okay, let's record a few things. And we start recording. Actually, let's get this up here, enable and record. We start recording and nothing happens. Okay, so we say, all right, well, let's get some scales. I'm gonna go down here to the community, Tim, like some of his stuff. And we'll just bring these down into a pattern. All right, so we'll bring these down. Okay, so maybe because I'm not using chords, I didn't get a recording. So we'll go ahead and we'll hit record again, and we'll start recording. And nothing. So that's the first thing that comes to mind sometimes, or first thing occurs. So let's understand how Studio One is set up. First of all, these fields that are in the track, the first one is the instrument that's actually responding to the MIDI. It's the instrument that they call it the output instrument, or instrument output. Think of it as what software is processing any MIDI that sits inside of this track. All right, that's what this guy does. Second line is the all inputs. This tells you what are the inputs that are putting data inside this track. All right, in this case, I'm using a little Atom pad, a little PreSonus Atom, nice little 4x4 pad. You also see Scalar 2 is listed down here. You don't want these both, you don't want this set to the input, because what you end up getting is a feedback loop, and you'll hear it by something like that. So if that's the case, just hit your MIDI cancel, and now you'll go ahead and turn this back off. Now Studio One is smart enough to, when you set it to all inputs, it's going to not pay attention to Scalar. But if you had other MIDI devices or you want to use your keyboard device once in a while, I just use all inputs. In this case, we'll leave it at Atom, just to be clear. So now, as I tap on my pad, the MIDI comes through, and that looks pretty good. So now that I've got some MIDI coming through, it's just being processed directly by the keyboard without any interpretation. So if we bind one of these areas, so if we bind area C, now we're going to bind these patterns. So as I play notes, or the last note, all right, I get those chords. So now when I hit record, all right, looks pretty good. That's kind of what we were expecting, I think. So if we play that back, sounds pretty good. However, we look what we recorded. We recorded just the notes. So if we unbind this, if we tell Scalar to stop paying attention to the MIDI notes, or stop interpreting those MIDI notes, or routing them to another part of Scalar, and just play them, we just get our keyboard. And that could be well and good. However, sometimes that's not what you're looking for, right? You're either looking for the rendered audio, or you're looking for the audio only, or you're looking for maybe the MIDI notes that Scalar is actually generating as it does its magic. So for example, if I turned this and went to perform mode, now we're having Scalar interpret those notes in a different way. Right? It's a whole different set of sounds that comes out of scalar. Same notes, ones with bound chords, ones with perform mode on, get different sounds. So first thing, it's important to understand, what are you trying to accomplish? What is the piece you're trying to pull out? So in this case, let's say we just want those chords, and all we want is the audio of those chords. We know that's right. Not going to be doing any real big changes to it. We just want the audio. So an easy way to deal with that in Studio One is just bounce the selection, right? That's, if you're a Studio One user, you're familiar with that. So now if I play that, we get the audio, but you'll see nothing's happened inside Scalar because this MIDI track has been automatically muted by Studio One, so we're not getting any of that noise, any of that sound coming back in. Now to unbind that or to unmute that, I've done it before, so it's already here, but if you go to your event, unmute events, and now you'll have this. So if we mute this guy and play the Scalar, all right, so now if we turn that off and let's mix it up a little bit, this is definitely going to be a hit song, I can tell already while I'm thinking about it. We're going to turn this on, and now if we play them together, all right, so there you go. So now we're playing the MIDI inside Scalar, running in one of the Scalar perform modes, and we've got the audio of Scalar from prior that had been rendered. So that gives us access to the audio, but let's say that we'd like to get the MIDI, all right? So let's say we want to see what that MIDI is. So let's take this guy, actually let's remove this track altogether, and let's take him out for now, and I'll just delete that event. Again, leaving things as is here. So if we, let's turn off perform. So one thing about Scalar, and I've got other videos on this, and I'll have others in the future. Scalar is an amazing tool. I think it's kind of the Swiss Army knife of musical tools, regardless of where you are in your musical skill levels. And one thing about Scalar, though, is there's a lot of little features and settings and so forth that can really change the way Scalar is delivering music back to you. So understanding what settings you have turned on and so forth makes a big deal. You will get in the habit of using that clear state on a regular basis just to get you back to a default so you know what's going on. So in this case, we've got our chords bound. We have our one instance of Scalar, but we don't just want those notes recorded, right? We would actually like to see and capture the MIDI that Scalar is capturing. Now, there's a couple ways to do that. The quickest and easiest, if you already have it, is just to drag the MIDI directly from Scalar into your DAW, right? So the way Scalar is an amazing tool when it comes to MIDI as well, in two ways. One, any change you make to Scalar is automatically and instantly written to the chords that you have enabled within Scalar. So right now, for example, if I'll just drag 4 of these guys. If I drag this, just left click, drag and drop, and I then don't make sure nothing's bound, and I play these, they're the chords, because all that MIDI information is written to these chords directly. As soon as I make a change, right, let's just delete that. Let's turn on perform mode for a minute. As soon as I make a change, I drag the exact same 4 chords. Now I get all of that MIDI data, all right? And if I take this, and let's say that I want to do something else. Let's say I just want to do an arpeggio across those guys. I'd like these 3 notes, bring those guys up there. I get those notes. So one of the cool things about Scalar is I can quickly create in Scalar the MIDI that I'm interested in. I can just drag and drop it to my DAW. So that's one of the easiest and quickest ways to get MIDI from Scalar into your DAW. The other great tool is just the Midi Capture. Simple Midi Capture tool, but very powerful and pretty much unlimited. I've run thousands and thousands and thousands of MIDI notes through Midi Capture, basically turned on looped playback and let it run for literally hours because I was curious about the cache and could not get it to overload. So anyway, the reason that's interesting is now if I turn on my Midi Capture, and let's just use the keyboard now. Let's say I want to do something like this. All right, not very interesting, but you get the point. All right, so now that MIDI is captured directly. So let's take that off and let's turn on my, the reason I left it on arpeggio. There we go, there's a great question. When I started tapping, I wasn't exactly sure why we were just getting one note, and it's because we had arpeggio on. Let's go to performances, let's do the same thing. So let's clear MIDI, so I'm going to clear the capture cache, and we're going to start recording again. So we're capture MIDI, so now we're going to do something a little different. All right, so stop that, drag that up. All right, and we'll turn off our perform mode and play that. Oh, sorry, let's turn off our perform mode and play that. So the Midi Capture is a great way to let you play around inside of Scalar using Midi Capture to quickly capture the MIDI that you're playing around with and dragging it and dropping it into your DAW. Very handy for pulling bass lines and top lines and things like that out of MIDI sequences that you've either put together creating patterns, or that you've played by hand, either using a MIDI controller or sometimes your mouse. You'd be surprised what you can do with the mouse. So here we go. We're back in looking at Scalar as it relates to getting that MIDI captured. So we're getting into another one of the setup pieces inside of Studio One. So in this case, what we're going to do is we're going to say duplicate track. So we're just going to duplicate the Scalar track. We're not selecting duplicate complete. We don't want to create another instance of the instrument. We just want another track created that's using the same instance of the instrument. So pretty much everything will look exactly the same as the one above. Now, a couple differences or a couple changes. First thing we want to do is we want to take this first guy and set that to none. We don't want this track to process anything. We just want it to be a container to hold information that's coming in. And we're going to send information from Scalar 2. Right? I'm not talking about sends in your mixer. I'm talking about sends from track to track. So in this case, we're going to process the MIDI through Scalar. It's going to land here. All right? So we're going to turn on these guys as well. And we're going to go ahead and we're going to play first on the keyboard. So since we're just play with the mouse, so what we'll hear at the beginning here is we'll just get something in this lower track. So if we go ahead and hit record. All right, so there's our MIDI, right, that we were expecting to see. Right, so there's all the MIDI notes that we expected. If we used our keyboard, did the same thing. Let's go ahead and bind it here and hit record. All right. So now we get our original note MIDI as well as our original pad MIDI, and we get the MIDI that Scalar has processed, or that effectively treated itself as a MIDI effect. Okay, for part 2, let's take a look at using Scalar to drive third-party instruments. So let's take out that second Scalar track we had here, and let's just add, I don't know, something simple like a Mai Tai. So I come over to my Browse, Instruments, my favorites. I've got the PreSonus instruments here. Mai Tai, and how about maybe Poly, let's do Acid Trip in there, okay? So, got the Mai Tai, all right, and let's go back into Scalar and do a couple things. Remember, everything is the same as before. We're going to use Scalar as we had it set up originally. And now we're going to go into our Mai Tai. We're going to let Mai Tai be the processor here. Okay. And for the inputs, we're going to set this now to Scalar. So again, Scalar is coming down and processing this. And as we toggle over to Scalar, right? We get our third-party instrument being driven by scalar. If I would select scalar and monitor both instruments, you probably hear that substantial is in there as well. If we turn this down a little bit, you can hear. Still got my scalar also playing. This makes it kind of interesting if you want to do some layered instruments. Play around with a lot of different combinations, and some more obvious than others. So that's pretty simple. If we go back into scalar, we can do all the different things we want to do. Let's turn this guy off, for example. Just turn scalar instrument off. And let's make it a little more interesting. Why don't we add, let's go back down into Artists, and why don't we go to our very own David Carbone, and how about I like up and down. That'll give us some chords to play with. We can even add a performance mode on that. Why don't we go out to our, let's go sequences. Actually, let's go to melodies. And maybe, yeah, melodies. And let's go down to riff. And let's do the riff all. It'll take all the parts of that particular melody. And if we play those, slow that down a little bit. And one thing to remember about performances is some of the performances have various lengths, and you can look at a couple of my other videos on the various performances in scalar. But what we want to do, we want to hear all of the actual bars that are in this particular, all the notes that are in this particular melody. So we're going to kick that on to 16 beats. And why don't we do this? Let's go ahead and send all of these chords down to a pattern. And we can do that. We can select them all very quickly by clicking in the middle here. In the gray area, say select all. Right mouse click and then say send to replace current pattern. We'll fill that one. We could also drag and drop just like we'd expect. Let's go ahead and then we play this guy. And why don't we add a little bit of bass to this just for fun. Here's a drum mix I pulled out of the EDM kit. I've actually got a drum mix already, or a track already established. We can drag this guy in from our pool. And let's get that out of the way. Drop him in there. And, let's put him on the right track. Let's drop him in there. Let's duplicate him a couple times. Just hit the D key. Okay. And let's just fade it in a little bit just for grins. And so now if we go back into scalar for a second, and we right mouse click on the play button here. Now the scalar playback here in our pattern is automatically connected to our play button here. So if we want these things to start on time, in time, we can now hit the play button. And that's about as simple as that. Off a little bit. Yeah. And so now we've got scalar driving our Mai Tai. We could add scalar voice into that. Like I said before, pretty simple. If we wanted to add, I don't know, let's do something we can hear. Let's how about a bass guitar? There you go. Simple as that. Okay. So that's it for setting up scalar. Both driving and recording itself, as well as recording or driving third-party instruments. And same, everything we learned in the part one applies. If we want to record on this particular guy, we can set that guy back, hit the record button, and we'll get all of our playback notes. And we can actually change those while we're playing in real time. All right, so hopefully that gives you some ideas on how to get Scalar configured in a way to work with the Scalar sounds themselves as well as third-party instruments. Thanks for joining us, and we'll be back with some more Scalar stuff somewhere in the near future.